In earlier lessons, we have seen the word implementation and test implementation in the front of the dependencies. So, what is the meaning of these words? These are configurations for the dependency class path. In other words, it tells us if the dependency exists within a given class path. Generally speaking, when we are working with Java project, there is a couple of class paths involved: compile class path and runtime class path. In the compile class path, we deal with a list of dependencies that are needed to allow the JDK to compile the Java code into bytecode. In the runtime class path, we deal with a list of dependencies that are needed to run the compiled Java code. When we add Gradle dependencies, all we do is configure which dependencies to appear on which class path. We have three options to configure our class path using the Gradle Java plugin configuration: runtime only, implementation, and compile only. In the runtime only, we set the dependency on the runtime class path only. In the implementation, we set the dependency on both the runtime and compile class path. And in the compile only, we set the dependency on the compile class path only. For test dependencies, it's pretty much similar to what we have in the previous slides. The dependency configuration for the test starts with the test word. So we have a three test configuration: test runtime only, and test implementation, and test compile only. In the test runtime only, we set the dependency on the test runtime class path only. In the test implementation, we set the dependency on the test runtime and compile class paths. In the test compile only, we set the dependency on the test compile class path only. So what is the advantage of using these different configurations? First off, we gain a faster compilation time due to fewer dependencies in the class path. Also, you won't unintentionally use a class from a dependency that should only appear on the runtime class path when you write the code. Now let's take a look at the configuration for the JSoup dependency, which is implementation at the moment. I'll run Gradle W dependencies to view the current configurations. I'll scroll a little bit up. And as we see here, the JSoup being called during the implementation configuration and during the runtime class path and during the compile class path. Now I'm going to change the configuration for JSoup dependency, and I'll change it to compile only, so we should not see the JSoup on the runtime class path. I'll change implementation to compile only. Let's clear the terminal, and I'm gonna run Gradle W dependencies again. And if we scroll a little bit up, we can see that JSoup library under the compile only path, also under the compile class path, but we don't see it under the runtime class path. Now I'm gonna change the configuration to runtime only. And I'll clear the terminal and run Gradle W dependencies. Let's scroll a little bit up. And we can see here that JSoup under the runtime class path, but not under the compile only class path. Now, since JSoup is being called during the runtime only configuration, we will not be able to compile the code because it's not available during the compilation time. And I'm gonna build the application, Gradle W clean build. And we got a failure because the compiler couldn't find the JSoup dependency at this line. Now I'm gonna change the configuration to CompileOnly. Clear the terminal and build the project again. And we can see here the project compiled successfully. But how about running the application? We won't be able to run it because the JSoup dependency is being called during the compile time only. So if we try to do Gradle W run, and this is the run task from the application plugin, and we got a failure. And to fix the failure, we need the JSoup library to be available on both configuration, the compile only and the runtime path. So I'll change this to implementation because it implicitly applies both. I'll clear the terminal and I'm going to execute Gradle W run. And the build successful. It's very important to understand your dependencies configuration, and to do so you can use the Gradle W dependencies command with the -- configuration option, and then you mention the configuration name. So I want to know the configuration for implementation. And we can see here that JSoup falls into the implementation configuration. Now let's run the same command again with the configuration compile only. And there is no such configuration in our current Gradle file. The only two configuration we have right now is implementation and test implementation.